The day started like any other in Stephen's modest Lagos neighborhood, where sounds of vendors selling wares, children playing, and traffic on the nearby streets hummed as a constant background. The simple life he shared with his mother, Amoka, had taught Stephen to appreciate the little he had. His mother always seemed content, working tirelessly to provide for him, though there was always a glimmer of sadness in her eyes that he didn't understand. Growing up, Stephen barely knew his father, Obi. He'd passed away when Stephen was just a boy, leaving only faint memories and a few old photos tucked away in a box at the back of his mother's closet. Obi's memory lingered around their small home, not as a figure of strength or protection but as a ghostly reminder of loss. Sometimes, Stephen would find his mother silently looking at the faded photos, her fingers running gently over them as if trying to hold on to a piece of the past. As Stephen grew older, questions started forming in his mind. Who was his father? Why had he left them with so little? Amoka never spoke of him, only mentioning in passing that Obi had once been a good man who had fallen victim to the ways of the world. Despite his curiosity, Stephen accepted this silence, burying his questions deep down, focusing instead on helping his mother and finding his way in life. But all of that changed the day his mother fell ill. It began as a mild fever, something Stephen assumed would pass in a few days. Amoka, always strong and resilient, brushed it off, insisting she was fine. But as the days turned into weeks, her condition worsened. She grew weaker, her skin paler, her voice a frail whisper of its former self. Stephen could see the light fading in her eyes, and it terrified him. He scraped together whatever money he could from his odd jobs and borrowed what he didn't have to get her to a clinic. But the doctor's news was grim. His mother's illness was advanced, and there was little they could do without expensive treatments. Stephen spent sleepless nights by her bedside, praying silently, hoping for a miracle that never came. One evening, as he sat beside her, Amoka reached out, gripping his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, though weary, held a strange intensity as she looked at him. Stephen, she whispered, her voice barely audible, there's something I need to tell you. He leaned closer, heart pounding. What is it, Mama? She hesitated, as though searching for the right words. Your father, he wasn't the man people thought he was. He was good, kind, but afraid. He hid something, a part of him, his legacy. I didn't understand it then, but now I think he left it for you. Stephen frowned, confused. His mother had always been so guarded about his father. Why now, in these final moments, was she bringing up his memory? What do you mean, Mama? What did he hide? She closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. It's all there, Stephen, you just have to have faith. Faith will guide you home. Before he could press her further, Amoka drifted into unconsciousness. She passed away quietly that night, leaving Stephen alone with his grief and a growing sense of mystery. In the weeks after his mother's passing, Stephen found himself haunted by her last words. Faith will guide you home, she had whispered, hinting at something left behind by his father, Obi. Yet, as the days turned into nights, Stephen's grief made him doubt. Was there really something hidden? Or was it simply a story his mother had clung to as a final comfort? One quiet evening, while clearing out his mother's belongings, Stephen discovered a familiar, weathered object hidden among her keepsakes, an old, leather-bound Bible that had once belonged to his father. Though his mother had rarely spoken of it, Stephen remembered seeing it on a high shelf when he was a child, barely out of reach, gathering dust in its solitude. Gently lifting the Bible from the shelf, Stephen felt a strange weight in his hands, as though it carried more than just pages within its binding. The cover was faded and cracked, and the scent of old leather and yellowed paper filled the air as he opened it. He began to leaf through the pages, searching for, he wasn't quite sure what. But as he flipped through the familiar passages, a small, folded piece of paper slipped out, catching his eye as it drifted onto the floor. Heart racing, Stephen knelt to pick it up. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note, discovering a short message in his father's unmistakable handwriting, faded yet legible. "Son, seek and you shall find." A chill ran down Stephen's spine. The words were simple, yet they carried a heavy promise. He realized that his mother's cryptic message about faith was leading him somewhere. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to the Bible, inspecting each page carefully, hoping that it held more clues. Halfway through the book of Proverbs, Stephen noticed something unusual. A tiny notch was cut into the back cover, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Slowly, he pried open the hidden compartment, revealing a small brass key wrapped in delicate parchment. What could this unlock, he murmured, his mind racing with possibilities. Attached to the key was another note, folded neatly, as if it had been waiting all these years for him. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, he unfolded it to find another message from his father. "When you're ready, let fate guide you to the home I left behind." Stephen's heart raced. The key in his hand felt both heavy and surreal, a link to a part of his father's life he had never known. He had grown up believing his father left nothing behind but struggles, yet here was a literal key, hinting at a hidden past that he was meant to unlock. But where would it lead? Stephen knew he couldn't just leave this mystery unsolved. The following day, he began his search in earnest, starting with their neighborhood, asking older neighbors who had known his father. Most had little to say, either dismissing Obi's life as unremarkable or clinging to vague rumors about his past success. Yet one name kept coming up in hushed tones: Baba Sola, an elderly man who had once been Obi's close friend. Following the whispers, Stephen finally tracked down Baba Sola, who lived on the outskirts of town. He found him in a small, cluttered shop filled with books and dusty artifacts. The old man's eyes lit up when he saw Stephen, immediately recognizing him as Obi's son. "Oh, Stephen. It's like seeing a ghost," Baba Sola said, his voice thick with nostalgia. "You look so much like your father. How can I help you, my boy?" Taking a deep breath, Stephen explained everything: the Bible, the key, and his mother's last words. Baba Sola listened quietly, nodding as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "Your father was a good man," Baba Sola began. "He had a small fortune once, but he kept it hidden when he felt betrayed by those closest to him. He always said he'd leave it behind for someone worthy, for you, Stephen. Do you know where it is?" Stephen asked, feeling a surge of hope. Baba Sola nodded slowly. "Yes, and I'll take you there, but be prepared. It's a journey that requires faith, like your mother said. This isn't just about finding wealth, Stephen, it's about understanding who your father truly was." With Baba Sola as his guide, Stephen's journey to uncover his father's secret legacy had begun. And as he held the brass key in his hand, he couldn't help but wonder what it would finally unlock. The journey with Baba Sola led Stephen to an unfamiliar part of town, far from the familiar bustle of his childhood neighborhood. They arrived at a secluded area on the city's outskirts, where the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and earth. They stopped at an old, gated property surrounded by towering trees that shielded it from view. "This place belonged to your father once," Baba Sola said, his voice carrying a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. "He purchased it years ago, long before you were born." Stephen looked around in awe. The house, though weathered and worn, still held a certain dignity in its architecture. He could feel the weight of memories lingering within its walls, memories that were hidden from him for so long. "Why did he keep this from us?" Stephen asked, his fingers tracing the rusty bars of the gate. Baba Sola sighed. "Your father was a proud man. After a string of betrayals from those he trusted, he became secretive. When he felt he couldn't trust anyone, he isolated himself. But he always believed that someday, someone would come who was worthy of his legacy. That person, Stephen, is you. Baba Sola reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Stephen's shoulder. This journey is more than finding his wealth, my boy. It's about understanding the weight of his life's work. As they stepped inside the gate, the key in Stephen's pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if reminding him of its purpose. He felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension as they approached the entrance of the house. The house was filled with dust and cobwebs, its furnishings covered in white sheets, like the ghost of a life left behind. Old picture frames lined the walls, showcasing glimpses of his father's past, a young Obi smiling at gatherings, a proud man in a suit standing beside a younger Baba Sola. There was even a photograph of Stephen as a baby, held in his father's arms, his face filled with a love Stephen had never seen. This was his sanctuary, Baba Sola explained as they walked through the rooms. He kept everything here that mattered to him. It was a safe haven. They reached a room at the far end of the hallway, and Baba Sola gestured for Stephen to enter alone. Your father left specific instructions for this moment. He wanted you to find what he left by yourself. I'll be waiting here. Swallowing hard, Stephen opened the door and stepped into what appeared to be a small study. The room had a dark, comforting ambience, with wooden shelves filled with books, trinkets, and more photographs. But at the center of the room was a single table, on which lay a locked box, ornate, made of dark wood, with a keyhole that looked as though it hadn't been used in decades. Stephen pulled out the brass key from his pocket. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's legacy in his hands. Carefully, he inserted the key into the lock and turned it. With a faint click, the lid of the box popped open. Inside, he found a collection of items, a set of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, an old journal, and a small leather pouch that jingled when he picked it up. Stephen opened the journal first, flipping through its pages to find his father's handwriting, filling each page with thoughts, fears, and dreams that Obi had once carried. As Stephen read through the journal, he began to piece together the man his father had been, a man driven by ambition and haunted by the weight of betrayal. Obi had once been a successful businessman, investing wisely and amassing a small fortune. But a close friend and partner had betrayed him, leaving him financially ruined and emotionally shattered. The betrayer had scarred him deeply, leading him to withdraw from the world. The letters were addressed to Stephen, each one written as if Obi had anticipated this very moment. In the first letter, Obi spoke of regret for not being there as Stephen grew up, for not leaving behind more than memories of struggle. The second letter, however, held words of hope, encouraging Stephen to take the legacy he was leaving and make something of himself. I may not have been the father you needed, but I hope to be the father you remember. Use what I have left wisely, my son. Build a life better than mine. Stephen's eyes stung with tears as he read. All his life, he had thought of his father as someone who had abandoned him. But here in these words, was a man who had simply been lost, who had wanted to provide but didn't know how. At the bottom of the box, Stephen found a folded map. Unfurling it, he saw that it marked a location in Lagos he didn't recognize. On the corner of the map was another note, "This is where your journey begins." Stephen shared the discovery with Baba Sola, who recognized the location as an old plot of land Obi had purchased as a final investment. Your father was clever, Baba Sola remarked. He left something tangible, a foundation on which you can build. The following morning, Stephen, armed with the map, traveled to the marked location. When he arrived, he found an unassuming plot, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. But there was something else, a buried safe hidden beneath a loose piece of earth, just as his father had indicated. Using a shovel he had brought, Stephen dug until he uncovered the metal safe, its lock still intact. With trembling hands, he used the key from his father's Bible and opened it, revealing stacks of old, well-preserved currency, documents proving land ownership, and a list of instructions detailing potential business ventures his father had envisioned. Stephen was stunned. His father's wealth wasn't just money, it was opportunity, a chance to rise above the circumstances they had lived in. He had the means to start afresh, to build a life not only for himself but to honor his father's struggles. As Stephen embarked on his new path, he took his father's words to heart. With Boba Sola as a mentor, he invested in a small business that quickly grew, transforming both his life and the community around him. He poured his heart into each endeavor, determined not only to succeed but to create something meaningful, something that would honor both his father and his mother. Through this journey, he discovered a deeper strength within himself. He realized that while his father had been a flawed man, he had still loved him deeply, leaving behind not only financial support but the faith that Stephen would become the man he had always dreamed of. In time, Stephen's business grew into a successful enterprise, providing jobs, uplifting his neighborhood, and inspiring others to see beyond their own hardships. He had become the man his father had hoped he would be: strong, compassionate, and wise. Years later, as Stephen stood before the house his father had once owned, he felt a peace he had never known. His father's Bible, now worn and filled with his own notes, lay in his hands. He understood now the faith his mother had spoken of, the belief in something greater than himself, in a legacy that transcended material wealth. Stephen smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Thank you, Papa," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude and love. The journey that had begun with loss had led him to a life filled with purpose. He knew now that he was not only his father's son but a man who would carry forward his own legacy, built on faith, resilience, and the love that had guided him home.